right, perfect. It is 7:05. If we want to get started, you can bring us in, Mike.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the first BAMR webinar. And today our subject, as you know, is kind of a comparison of similarities and differences between the AIDS crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, I am Mike Balaban. For those of you who don't know, I'm a former international investment banker. I spent the last decade focusing on civil rights and trying to build LGBT community through the sharing of stories and of first-person experiences.
Perfect. And I am Caleb Holland. I'm a documentary and commercial filmmaker. As a storyteller and as a gay man, LGBTQ rights have always been a part of my work. I've covered the trans rights movement, the movement to end gay conversion therapy, and I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm very excited to be speaking with our two juggernauts today. They have incredible experiences that I'm excited to learn from.
So we're joined today by two trailblazers of the LGBT community, Eric Sawyer and Dr. Howard Grossman. Both men were deeply involved in the early response to the AIDS crisis and have continued to fight for the health of our community today. Gentlemen, welcome. Would you please introduce yourselves? You want to go first, Eric?
Sure. My name is Eric Sawyer. I'm an openly gay man living with HIV since symptomatic since '81 when it was still called GRID. I live in New York City. I helped start the protest group ACT UP that did lots of demonstrations to get the government to respond to AIDS, to develop AIDS treatments, etc. I helped start a group called Housing Works that is the largest provider of housing and services, including medical services, to homeless people living with AIDS. I helped start an organization called Health Gap that worked to get generic AIDS medications into the developing world and fought for the creation of things like the Global Fund for HIV, TB, and Malaria, and the PEPFAR program. And I also worked for UNAIDS, the HIV programs at the United Nations, where I was asked to come in to the UN headquarters and be a liaison for anything that happened related to HIV at the UN headquarters, a liaison to non-governmental entities like everything from AMFAR to GMHC to activist groups. So that's me.
Thank you, Eric. Howard?
My name's Howard Grossman. I'm basically, I'm a primary care internal medicine doctor who specializes in HIV medicine and LGBTQ health. I saw some of the first cases of HIV when I was in my early training. I was at Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn, which for those of you who know it is one of the largest public health hospitals in the country, probably in the world. And we had some of the earliest cases before we even knew what we were dealing with. I was in private practice in New York for almost 40 years. And with some brief stints, ran the American Academy of HIV Medicine in Washington for 2 years and practiced a short time in San Francisco and then with Fenway in Boston before returning to New York. Now I'm in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, doing the same work with Midway Specialty Care, which is a 13-center practice here in South Florida. I was involved with ACT UP, which is how I met Eric, very involved with the Treatment and Data Committee. And you know, in those days, I was the doctor with the earring. That was a long time ago. But I've stayed really involved with the activist community over these years.
Thank you, Howard.
Well, thank you both so much, and we're so excited to have you. Our first question is for you, Dr. Grossman. Hearing more of your story this week and learning more about the work that you've done, you know, as you said, you've treated some of the first HIV and AIDS patients in the early 1980s. What were the early days of that crisis like? Are there any specific stories that stand out? Just, you know, what was that time like?
There's so many, but I mean, like the overwhelming thing is it was a scary time, and it was a scary time because we had no idea what we were dealing with. In fact, at my hospital, looking back, we thought we were seeing a huge number of cases of endocarditis. Most of our patients were intravenous drug users. And so we thought we were seeing endocarditis, a bacterial infection in the heart that was probably pneumocystis, but we didn't even know it back then. I mean, remember, science was much younger. There were so many things that we take for granted in science now that we didn't have back then. Back then, a T cell sorter to count T cells was a room full of machines. Now it sits on the counter. You know, it's so many years ago. So we had no idea what we were dealing with. We didn't know if it was a virus. In those early days, they were blaming it on poppers and on, it was only people who had too many sexual partners, and it was so many things nobody knew. As a house staff officer, we were not using gloves. Nobody used gloves in those days. I remember the arguments of people saying, "Oh, I can never draw blood with gloves." Imagine, I mean, that was the argument that was going on. We can't do this. And now you would never draw blood without gloves. So many things like that. I remember going to the first GMHC town hall at Julia Richmond High School on the Upper East Side of New York. A friend and I sitting up in the balcony, first time I ever saw Larry Kramer, and listened as they terrified everybody in that room with what was going on to Larry's friends, really, and as it was beginning to spread. I mean, so many things going on at that time trying to get a handle on this.
Just to explain for those in the audience who may be too young to know, Larry Kramer was the primary founder of ACT UP and a seminal figure in the AIDS Act.
And GMHC.
Right.
And the author of The Normal Heart, which a lot of people saw on television just a few years ago.
Perfect. And before our next question, we invite everyone to ask questions in the chat. Anything that comes up, feel free to shoot a question in there, and at the end, we'll circle back for a Q&A. Thank you, Dr. Grossman.
The next question is for Eric Sawyer. During the AIDS crisis, the response from the federal government was severely and shamelessly delayed. Would you mind sharing with our viewers the specific event that prompted you to get involved with ACT UP? Then what were the early days of that organization like in its formation? And what was it that enabled them to finally get the government to begin taking the crisis seriously?
Sure. Well, I got involved in ACT UP largely because of my friendship with Larry Kramer, who I've known since 1980. He was one of the very first people I met when I moved to New York. But my primary motivation for getting involved with ACT UP was that I was absolutely crippled by grief and anger for the most part. Grief over the loss of Scott Bernard, who was my lover, my soulmate, the first person that I was madly in love with. And I was so angry that I couldn't do anything to save his life. And, I cared for him for over 2.5 years, where he went from weighing 195 pounds, being a diamond slope skier, and had been a varsity tennis player at MIT, to literally being able to carry him to the bathroom, weighing 125 pounds, skeleton with KS lesions everywhere. And I was so angry that there were no drugs to treat him to try to save his life, that the government didn't care, that he was treated horribly by the public, that I just felt that I had to do something. I also was symptomatic at the time, so I was worried about my life. So after Scott died, I called Kramer, and I had been renovating brownstones in Harlem and knew how to develop housing. And I learned that there were lots of homeless people. Some of my friends became homeless when they were fired from their jobs and evicted from their apartment because of AIDS. And I called Larry up and I said, "Hey, Larry, I want to try to do something to develop some housing for homeless people with AIDS." And Larry said, "Well, I'm going to give a speech next week at the Gay and Lesbian Community Center, and I'm asking people to come and help me, and I'm going to call for the formation of a civil disobedience organization to demonstrate like the anti-war movement or the civil rights movement, and try to create havoc and force the government to fucking do something to save our lives. And he said, the only person that's doing anything about housing in New York is a guy named Doug Dornan that's running the AIDS Resource Center. He's coming to this speech. Why don't you come? Why don't you bring a lot of your pretty boy friends from Fire Island as boy bait and stand up in the audience and volunteer to help us and help us plan this first demonstration. I'll introduce you to Doug, and maybe we can see if together we can get some housing going. And so I brought a lot of my friends. I stood up and offered to help, and immediately got involved. And there was such a sense of release, in a way, of being able to turn that anger and that grease into action, to try to fight and save our lives. The first demonstration was blocking traffic at the corner of Wall Street across from Trinity Church. And the demonstration went, viral. There were, coverage on it was a 7 a.m. protest. There was coverage on the morning news, on the noon news, the evening news, for a couple of days. They didn't call us AIDS activists. They were like gay men, arrested, protesting for the lack of a government treatment or for AIDS drugs. And it was really empowering to, see the government pay attention and the media pay attention to, our demands that our lives be respected, and that our right to life finally get recognized. So I was hooked immediately and started, literally spending every night, every weekend, helping to organize the next demonstration, and then the next demonstration, the next government office takeover, the next pharmaceutical office assault.
I think it's really important to mention, I think for a lot of your audience, probably a lot of them weren't even alive at that time.
1987.
The last couple of months of this COVID-19 crisis is what it felt like. Nobody knew what was happening. There was nothing to treat it. People were scrambling, trying to figure out what it was we were dealing with. You had a government where the president's press secretary was caught on camera basically laughing about that there was anything going on. And it was happening. One of the big differences, it was happening to mainly 4 groups of people who nobody cared about. It was we used to call it the 4 H's: homosexuals, hemophiliacs, Haitians, and heroin users, IV drug users, and nobody cared about any of those groups. And that's very different than this global pandemic where everybody's at risk.
And on that note, you were having to process science in real time and try to understand exactly what was going on. Can you describe some of the similarities and differences between what was going on at that time and what we've seen here with the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, there was no science, but I think over the first 20 years of the epidemic, or 15 years of the epidemic, we learned to process science as it was happening. So you learned to look at raw data and try to figure out what was reliable and try to figure out what you could do with this stuff to try to help people. And that's, I think, the biggest problem for people now, is that they're not used to that. Many people in this country and around the world, especially in this country, are scientific illiterates, basically. And this information is pouring out of the scientific establishments, and people don't know how to process it. We're so used to science being written in stone. Yes, this drug works this way. This is what, I think even for young medical people, so used to having algorithms for treatment. If this, you go this way. If not, if it's a yes, you go this way. If it's a no, you go that way. And you have these flowcharts of how to treat things. This is all, science as it happens. And so you have to learn to be perceptive, listen as well as possible, be skeptical of people who claim to be way ahead of the scientific curve, and try to find ways to treat people, keep people alive.
Absolutely.
I would actually want to interrupt for 1 second. When we started this conversation before the audience came on, you told me there was some breaking news, Howard, in terms of some announcement on the Lancet, the medical journal last night. Do you want to share that with everyone?
Well, sure. I mean, I think everybody's heard in the last 2 weeks about remdesivir, which is a nucleotide analog. And people, I don't mean to scare people, but we know nucleotide analogs. A lot of people out there are either taking HIV medications or on PrEP, and you're taking a nucleotide analog. Tenofovir is a nucleotide analog. So similar drug from the same company, actually, from Gilead Sciences. And we've heard a lot about that. But last night, the first, an actual study was released in the Lancet that showed that a 3-drug regimen of, it's actually 4 drugs, but lopinavir, ritonavir, interferon beta, and I'm going blank.
That's all right. I'll come to you.
Ribavirin. Sorry. Oh, did you lose me?
No, you're here.
No, you're.
Okay, I lost you guys on screen. But anyway, and that these drugs together were able to decrease the time to getting a negative nasal swab in hospitalized patients by, it looks like, about 45%. And that's really significant.
That's huge.
And those are HIV drugs, some of them, correct, Howard?
Yes, so lopinavir, ritonavir is an HIV drug. These are all generic drugs. They're all widely available around the world. It's not like, you have to go looking for them. They're drugs that we've used for a significant amount of time.
But of course, if past experience is any guide, Pepcid's no longer available in the drugstore because everybody went out and bought it. So the moment something like this becomes known,
right,
a lot of demand, right?
Well, you do
exactly.
need a prescription for them, though.
Say again?
You do need a prescription,
Right.
but we've been using these drugs for an extended period of time. We know what they do. We know what they do. We know how they work, and we know their toxicities. So this is really exciting because these drugs are out there. They're readily available. They're not all that expensive. We don't have to wait for compassionate use. We don't have to wait for this to ramp up, and they're there to treat patients right now. And it's the first major study. So remember, thanks to our lunatic in chief in the White House, the U.S. stockpile, strategic stockpile, now has 29 million doses of hydroxychloroquine. Which I should say is a drug that nobody uses to treat malaria anymore, even though the press keeps reporting that, because most malaria is resistant to it. So the only thing is, if we suddenly have an epidemic of lupus in this country, we're going to have a drug that'll be useful. But this is actually something that seems to be work and that has been validated in at least this one study.
Perfect.
As a treatment, but not a vaccine, does it have to go through layers of trials, or can it be begun being prescribed as is?
This was a phase 2 trial, but because these are readily available drugs, in this country at least, doctors are allowed to prescribe for any use that they can justify medically. And here we have a study to justify it. They can start to prescribe these right away.
Perfect. Now, following up on that, you have treated COVID-19 patients, and you actually were diagnosed as well yourself. What are some of the lessons that the LGBTQ community maybe have from years of dealing with HIV and AIDS that could be applicable to how we look to the future of COVID-19?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Sure. So we have a long history as the LGBTQ community with dealing with HIV and AIDS. What lessons have we learned that might be applicable moving forward with COVID-19 for the wider population?
Well, like I said, I think people need to learn how to process this science as it's happening. Need to learn to look for validated studies, what's an opinion versus fact. You know, if you're sitting and watching most of the television networks these days, including the ones that I watch, CNN and MSNBC, you are getting 24/7 what a friend of mine calls terror porn. It's specifically designed to keep your eyeballs on that TV. And to scare the shit out of you all the time, and not to help you figure out how to process this. And that's a shame, because we need to be learning how to deal with this. I mean, really is an avalanche of data. Now, that's a big difference than the early days of HIV, because science moved at a much slower pace, and lay people didn't have access to science. One of the things that ACT UP did was blow down the doors of the FDA and the NIH and places like that, and open up science to people with a personal interest in what was going on. That's a big change since those early days. But now we're dealing with multiple scientific institutions. We're dealing with science that can happen very quickly. And it really is hard for a lot of people to keep up, and it's terrifying a lot of people.
Howard, I was going to ask you a question, but I'm getting it separately from a couple of individuals. In fact, one of them is a friend, Dr. Rick Silverman, is saying, are there any thoughts about individuals on PrEP, either Truvada or Descovy, or medicated for HIV, and whether these drugs may increase or decrease resistance to COVID-19? I'm not sure if there's any data, but I've heard rumor in both directions. We were speaking about this earlier. So both, what are the risks for the HIV plus community, and are there any potential benefits you think that this might have in store?
Well, you know, number one, for the HIV community, there was a tremendous amount of fear at first that people with HIV were going to be at higher risk for getting sick, for getting this disease, and at higher risk for dying. From what we've seen, and there was a big cohort report published from Spain a couple of weeks ago, people with HIV are at no increased risk for getting COVID-19, and in fact, according to them, may be at a slightly decreased risk. Now, maybe some of that has to do with the fact that HIV medications are having some impact on this virus, but nobody's really sure because we don't know yet. Now we have evidence that at least this one HIV medication, in combination with other medications, and remember, ribavirin was used very early on to try to treat HIV. It just was not very successful. In fact, I think that was one of the drugs that Rock Hudson was flown to Paris to get. Do you remember that, Eric?
I think you're right. Yep.
Yeah, it was ribavirin. And so here it comes again. But so the you know, people with HIV put their bodies on the line for science. I mean, that is something people need to realize. People with HIV, and not because of desperation, but because people, well, part of it was, but mostly because people wanted an answer, and they wanted to be part of the process of finding that answer. The bravest people I ever knew were the people who were putting their bodies on the line for science. And because of that science, we're able to actually develop things relatively quickly. I mean, let's face it, the world knows about this virus for 5.5 months. It took 16 years for us to develop even workable HIV therapy. So 5.5 months is a drop in the bucket.
Wow.
Yep.
Was that because the virus was so different, or just because of the delayed, government response, or both?
Well, there was a lot of delayed government response. I mean, some drugs were sitting there at the NIH. They weren't being tried early on.
Yeah.
Remember, AZT was developed by the federal government. And like I said, science was different then. It was slower. We didn't have the tools that we have now either.
That's one of the things that ACT UP is credited for, was actually changing the drug approval process and the research process for the FDA to actually release a drug. When ACT UP started, the lead time through the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials was usually 10 to 15 years. And they had really long efficacy trials, safety trials, and dosing trials. Each of them having 3 to 5 years with tens of thousands of patients. And ACT UP said that other countries have clinical trial processes where they use far fewer patients for 6 months to 18 months. They bring drugs to trial. I'm sorry, to market quicker. Why can't we do that here? And especially for HIV, because we're all going to be dead long before any drugs are developed, because it was taking, as we were saying, 10 to 15 years for a drug to be developed, when the average person with AIDS was dying within a year to 18 months of diagnosis. And so, we fought for an expedited drug approval process and won.
Perfect.
Right. And not only that, what was going on was you had this scientific establishment that thought it knew everything, and they had a way of doing things, and they weren't going to do it any other way. So I remember in the late 80s when there was a new drug called ganciclovir, and it treated cytomegalovirus retinitis. Now remember, CMV still around, but that we had no treatment for it, and people with HIV were going blind from it. And here came this drug that suddenly had an effect. And I went with Marty Delaney, who was one of the biggest AIDS activists and treatment activists in the country, who founded Project Inform in San Francisco, and Jay Lipner, who was a lawyer who had come out of the housing area and worked for the federal government, but he became an activist, and Jay also had HIV. And we went and met with Ellen Cooper, who was at the FDA. And I remember this was my first foray into lobbying the government for this stuff. And I remember her sitting there and saying, yeah, we see that this drug works, but, okay, there's an approval process. It's going to go through that. It's, we're going to, this is the way we do things here. And we were fighting for not just compassionate use, but what became expanded access, that the drug was released more widely for thousands of people very quickly. But this was not the way things were done. And that was over and over and over was the same thing. When viral load testing first came out, I remember having this huge argument with a couple of researchers who had access to the test to measure HIV viral load for research, but they were using it for their clinic patients, but they didn't want us in the community to have it. And we had this huge fight about why it was important to let us in the community see how this test worked to get it out faster. Why should they have access?
And people, a lot of people don't know. We say we fought to get these changes made. The campaigns were, basically kind of stormtrooper campaigns. Two of our biggest demonstrations in the early days, one was storm the NIH, and the other was to attack the FDA. They happened on successive years, and we literally, and they were summer demonstrations, we literally, took tens of buses from New York and Chicago and Atlanta. People flew in from all over the coast, and thousands of protesters literally went to the FDA headquarters and shut the building down. We took over the building. All of the people ran from the offices. The same thing happened to the NIH the next year. Literally, we had people with smoke bombs, colored smoke bombs on 15-foot long sticks that, were sending plumes of colored smoke, all over, marching through the several building campus of NIH, and scaling the front overhang of the door, and dropping posters from them, going over in and taking people's offices over. And that type of in-your-face behavior with 1,000 people laying on the ground in a die-in in front of like fake tombstones that they had made for their own death from government genocide, scared the shit out of the government. And, we took over tens of their clinical trial expert advisory panel meetings. And, eventually also, while we were doing these stormtrooper techniques, we had experts like Howard and other treatment geeks going in, with literally 5-year plans on how the research process in the federal government had to change to get drugs to market quicker, and to, expand compassionate use and get drugs into people's bodies, once they knew that they weren't going to kill them, even if they didn't know how effective they were going to be in hopes of saving people's lives.
You both have touched on something that we had spoken about in our run through, which I wanted to ask, which is, sometimes government and medical professionals can think in formulaic and bureaucratic ways rather than out of the box. When out of the box and creative thinking may be what's needed to move solutions forward. And we spoke about examples from the AIDS era and examples now, and I wonder if both of you would care to address those. If you don't bring them up, I can remind you the ones we talked about, but I'll let you do that.
Sure. I want to pick up on what Eric said though first, and because I think a lot of younger people think ACT UP was all about demonstrations and, having fun, great, tombstone signs and, silence equals death and Ronald Reagan has blood on his hands, but ACT UP's brilliance was to do something that had never been done before. And that was to do these demonstrations because you had to blow down the doors of these organizations. They were so rigid that they wouldn't listen to you. So you had to blow them down, but then you had people coming in behind that saying, okay, now you'll take a meeting with us. This is what we want. And as Eric said, with plans, with science, some of the best scientists I know grew out of ACT UP. They taught themselves, and so they're now some of our most brilliant epidemiologists, doctors who came off that floor at the Gay and Lesbian Community Center. Greg Gonzalez at Yale is a perfect example. He's a brilliant epidemiologist, and he came out of ACT UP. And he's been doing an amazing job of explaining online some of what's going on with COVID-19. But there was the media. You had, Ann Northrop, who worked at CBS. You had other people who'd been involved in media for years, who gave their expertise to figure out how to use the media to get this message across. So it was a combination of incredible talent, amazing brain trust, as well as people out there in the streets laying their bodies on the line.
And a lot of it was, getting people affected by the illness, people living with HIV, and people in the main risk groups or main infected community, like drug users and sex workers, involved in coming up with the response to the epidemic that would make sense, like needle exchange, for example, giving people who injected drugs a clean needle, so they wouldn't have to share a needle every time they injected drugs. They could use a clean needle and not have residue of the blood and viruses of the person who used it before injected into their bloodstream. And
imagine how radical that idea was. That idea, people looked at you. You're going to give needles to people who are using drugs. They thought we were crazy.
Right. And one of the areas that I get involved in, I talked about developing housing works. Well, we knew from research we'd done on housing that stable housing is actually a better predictor of life expectancy and survival of illnesses than is medical care. Wow. If you don't have a roof over your head, a place to cook a meal, a place to take a bath and stay out of the elements, you'll die much quicker than if without a Medicaid card and medicine than you will if you have medicine and medical care but don't have a roof over your head or a place to cook meals. And so we started Housing Works because we knew there were lots and lots of homeless people or people becoming homeless when they developed AIDS because of being fired from their jobs or evicted from their apartment, and knew that they were dying on the streets far quicker than the average person who was housed. And so we developed not only, a push to get access to the latest treatment, to Medicaid cards for people who didn't have insurance or couldn't afford treatment, but also to get them, medically appropriate housing, to get them food stamps for food security, to get them drug treatment if they were addicted to drugs, things that they needed that were addressing structural interventions to address the social drivers like homelessness and hunger and drug addiction that would need to be addressed in order for them to be able to survive HIV. Flipping to my career in the UN, I was recruited because I helped to lead the response here in this country. And the response globally was one of prevention only. Developing countries, the ones that have all the money like the US, cared about HIV, but they only wanted to stop the spread of it in poor countries to keep the case numbers down so those poor people didn't come to rich countries and get our rich white people sick. And so they were just, trying to push condoms and abstinence programs on people in the developing world. People like myself who, by the time people were talking about AIDS in Africa had been surviving for 10 years with an AIDS diagnosis, were saying, what the fuck? You can't just try to prevent HIV. You've got to give people
You're freezing.
AIDS. When a mother of three, with 3 kids in Africa dies in a year, that's morally unacceptable. And they were like, oh, the drugs are too expensive. And people like me were saying they don't have to be. The only thing that's making them expensive are the patents that drive the prices up. Why can't we waive the patents on drugs in the developing world? Why can't we develop generic copies of the medications and get them distributed for free, because it'll have to be to somebody making $1 a day in Africa. Meanwhile, you also have to try to ensure that those people have access to food, because
and clean water.
A day, yeah, exactly.
Clean water.
And clean water and sanitation, because if they're only making $1 a day and you're gonna charge them anything for a medication, you've got to make sure they can feed themselves. And so we started this whole campaign attacking the patent system. There are things called the TRIPS Accord. It deals with waiving the patents on essential medications in developing countries to save the lives of poor dying people. There's things like compulsory licensing and parallel importing of generic drugs for countries that don't have a generic AIDS industry. There's something called the Doha Agreement. They're all like, way too far in the weeds for this kind of a discussion. But we also called for a global war chest to pay for treatments and prevention in the developing world.
Right, Eric, and I think, the point is that these were things that came out of activist thinking, and they were things that were thinking outside the box. I remember people getting up at meetings and saying, well, we can't bring drugs to Africa because they don't have clocks. They can't take drugs because they don't have clocks, and you'd have to take these drugs at least twice a day. And you looked at them and you said, okay, you're talking about farmers who get up with the sun and go to sleep with the sunset. I think they know 12 hours apart. It turned out that people in Africa, for example, were far more adherent to their medications than people in the developed world. Wow. So, but all of this took breaking down those old ways of thinking and challenging that. That was
people who weren't hung up in an ivory tower.
We've got some time issues, and that we want to save some for the audience questions. I'm going to let Caleb ask a quick question, and then I'll close with one for the future, and we'll over to the audience. Caleb?
Sure, and thank you both for highlighting the, I think these moments really highlight, inequalities and the differences are different, based on that. So thank you for highlighting that. So our next question for Eric would be, and actually this could be for you both. So a lot of what you're talking about is changing public behavior. Obviously, with HIV and AIDS, that was, giving needles. It was, highlighting condom use, that sort of thing. Now we're talking about masks for COVID-19. Tell us about what does it take to change public opinion, and what is the process of doing that?
Well, you're talking about creating new societal norms. I mean, before the early 1980s, nobody used condoms. They were only used for preventing STDs and pregnancy. And gay men didn't really have to worry about the pregnancy. And as far as STD goes, we thought we could treat everything. So nobody used condoms. So the idea that at that point that was our best prevention method to try to create this societal norm that now everybody knows about, that was a huge undertaking. There were so many people who said, "You're taking away my pleasure." It's like it was the same issue with wearing gloves to draw blood. Truthfully, you were changing a societal norm that people just didn't believe was going to be able to work. So I think one of the important things is you don't do this through shaming people.
Mhm.
It has to be that people see the need, they have to understand the need, and you have to support people to make these enormous changes. Now, right now, people are wearing masks out of fear, okay? But fear doesn't work forever. I've often told the story. I remember watching on TV during the wars in Croatia, the Balkan states. Bombs were dropping. People were shooting each other in cities. The war was going on. After a certain number of days at home, these little ladies all in black were out with their shopping baskets because they had to get food. I mean, everything gets normalized eventually.
Yeah.
But now is the time we have to actually educate people about why these new norms make sense, and what benefit it is for them.
Well, and it's a tough time right now because I'm in Georgia, so I'm seeing people are, starting to break the rules, not social distance. Businesses are opening back up. So Eric and Dr. Grossman, how do we continue to keep that conversation going and to, inspire people to make that change and continue along with the guidelines?
I think it's very important that we come up with reasonable things for people to do. So, for example, I don't really think that social distancing is going to last as a strategy. It's just too difficult. You go to the grocery store now, the aisles are full of people, not 6 feet apart, but then you get up to the cash register and they're 6 feet apart. But because they're 6 feet apart, the line extends down the aisle, so people are crowding the aisles even more. You're not going to be able to shut down every industry, but I think there are precautions that we know are vital. You need to wear a mask when you're in any place where there's crowds of other people. Okay, if everybody's wearing a mask, and I've been asking this question online to try to find evidence. If you're wearing a mask and I'm wearing a mask and everyone else around me is wearing a mask and nobody's coughing or sneezing because they've been screened at the door, how much more protection do we get from standing 6 feet apart? And I can't get an answer to that question when everybody has a mask and nobody's coughing and sneezing.
Right.
Okay, so you need to screen people at the door of establishments. We have to create a norm the same way we have done in hospitals and in clinics for healthcare providers. We call it foam in, foam out. There's a station, you've seen it in your doctor's office. They foam thing in when they walk in the room. When they walk out of the room, they foam again. And that is standard operating procedure at every hospital in this country. That's what we need to do. You walk into the Apple store, foam in. You walk out, you foam out. And then the other piece is you get home, you remember what your mother said. When you come in from the street, you wash your hands, right? So you come into your house or you come into your place of business, you wash your hands, okay? Those are reasonable things that people can sustainably do that will substantially decrease their risk. And I think it's not shaming, but we need a rule. You're going to the supermarket, you wear a mask. You don't want to wear a mask? That's fine. That's up to you. You can't come in the supermarket. Starve. Or find your own market where where they don't care if people wear masks. It's the same thing with the anti-vaxxers. You don't want to vaccinate your kid? That's your right as a person to not do that, but they can't come to my kid's school because we're not going to get your disease. And you can figure it out.
Perfect.
I just want to ask one question before we head over to the audience. You know, as we look to the future, what do you think the next 6 to 12 months holds in store for us? And what is whatever the new normal is going to look like when we learn to try to coexist with COVID going forward? Because we're going to have to for at least the next year or two.
Mm-hmm.
I think it depends on what happens. You know, I'm really worried about a lot of states starting to reopen. I think it's way too early. And if we see a huge rebound in you know, new cases and spiking of hospitalizations and death, we may end up going backwards and basically still be in the same place we are with lots more new infections because we opened too early. So I think time will tell.
And that's important. And I will tell you that in my own practice, since the new antibody tests have come out in the last 3 weeks that are commercially available through the big labs, and since we don't have a shortage of the swabs to do the PCR test for active infection, anybody who walks in my office and wants that test is getting it. And I've been testing a lot of people. So far, aside from myself, and I already knew that I had had an asymptomatic infection back at the beginning of March, and was now antibody positive. But other than me, one patient of mine turned up positive. So that means because people took the social distancing very seriously and were scared to death, especially in a place like this where there's so many older people, there are huge numbers of susceptible people. In New York now, you have 20 to 30% of people who've already been infected, okay? So that's a big part of the population. It's not herd immunity yet, but it's a big number. Here in Florida, I'm guessing if it's like my practice, most people, the vast majority of people have not been infected and are still susceptible. So you open up really fast, boom, you're gonna wipe out all those people.
All right. Well, Eric and Dr. Grossman.
Can I say one quick thing? Because we talked about vulnerable populations with HIV. We can't walk away from this without saying that this disease is disproportionately affecting people of color, especially African Americans. I mean, really African Americans. We're talking 80% of the deaths in certain cities where people where African Americans make up maybe 15 or 20% of the people. There's something seriously wrong going on here that's certainly not being addressed by this administration.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Eric and Dr. Grossman, thank you so much. This has been so enlightening. Mike, I know you and I really appreciate this so much. And we're going to move to audience Q&A. We're a little bit past time, so we'll do a little bit of a lightning round, and we can go a little bit over. So
can you go over?
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't have anything to do, so.
Nor do I.
Who does?
Perfect. So actually, following up with what you said, Dr. Grossman, there was a question in the chat about an increase in anti-Asian American sentiment. You know, we're hearing that, you know, this is worse for people of color, and people of color are experiencing discrimination. What have we learned from anti-LGBTQ sentiment in the 80s and 90s, and how can that be applied for people of color today?
Well, you know, I think anti-LGBT prejudice have been around a long time. We knew that, and you know that wasn't anything new. But I think that the level of hostility to Asian Americans, which we can lay at the foot of one person, Donald Trump. I mean, it is his fault. He made this happen. He created a scapegoat.
The what?
His saying China virus, China virus.
Right. He is he's a combination of Hitler and Goebbels. I mean, he has created a scapegoat when people are seriously scared out of their wits, and it's but now this is inciting violence, and you know, it's getting people shot. There's nothing even remotely funny about it. I mean, I think the man is guilty of genocide. You know, there's a Donald Trump death clock up in Times Square right now on a billboard, like the death clock. This is his death clock that's monitoring the excessive deaths because of the actions that he's taking. And today it was up near 45,000 that you can lay at his feet. So how do you stop it? I think Asian American leaders need to come out really, really strong. I think we need to take the dialogue, and we need to take the narrative away from the White House and put it in other centers. I think we need to get them off of television. We need to hear from honest people. We need to stop this terror porn on the networks and give people information that they can use for their own life. All of that. And we need to fight back against these racists who are running around with shotguns on Capitol steps and not getting arrested.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just stressing that the virus doesn't discriminate.
Yeah.
Anybody can get it.
All right, so I've, let's see, a question here. Many people say that the AIDS crisis actually led to a number of social developments, the importance of same-sex marriage rights and the importance of patient treatment with drugs. What kind of unanticipated effects do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic might have for society in the future?
But we can only hope that this is highlighting all the cracks in our society. That the one I'm waiting for is universal health care in the US. The fact that you cannot have people running around uninsured. Eric's issue of homeless people. The fact that we are now putting homeless people into hotels and into some kind of housing, realizing that you can't have people roaming around the streets at increased risk of getting sick themselves. Those are two things that I'm hoping will change when we get out of this.
Any additions, Eric?
Yeah, well, Housing Works actually realized that, homeless people and poor people are at a real disadvantage for this. So Housing Works, joined with some other people and were distributing PPE, personal protective equipment to homeless people, to poor people. They created shelters, as Howard was saying. They got some hotels to turn over rooms to them, and they put homeless people into them, and they use their clinic licenses to actually develop some medical clinics to treat homeless people. And so, those are the types of things that need to happen. We need to, equalize the, societal economic disparity that happens with regard to access to homeless, to housing, to food security, to medical care. We need universal health care. We need universal housing, at a level that is medically appropriate, as well as food security for everyone. And so I'm hoping that COVID helps us be a more humane society that starts caring better for people who are at an economic disadvantage.
Absolutely.
Right. And realizing that people are one paycheck away from disaster. I mean, Andrew Yang's, universal basic income was a pie in the sky thing a couple of months ago. But we need to make sure that there's backup for people when they lose their job, or they can't live on the edge the way so many people have been doing. We can't have that as a society.
It's going to take people voting the Republican Party out of key offices for that to happen.
That's right. It's not going to happen while they're in power. It just won't, because all they care about is the money. They live in their gated communities, and if the person next door to them and their family is okay, everything must be fine. There's such an empathy deficit. And I would actually also urge for the fact that we need to increase scientific literacy in this country really fast, because when things like this happen, people need to be educated how to look at this information that's coming out of so many sources. And we can't get rid of the anti-science thing.
Literacy, period, so they can understand how to follow the news and know when they're being given BS and when it's the truth.
Yeah. All right, so we'll ask two more audience questions and then Mike will close us out. So this is actually a really interesting question. Why are we not seeing activist organizing among people who had COVID-19?
Because they've been dying. I mean, let's face it. People have been dying for the last 2 months. You're not going to like pull the respirator out of your face and walk and march in the street. We'll see what happens afterwards.
There,
You
there,
know,
there have been people, still doing some socially distancing demonstration. The Never Trumpers and the Rise and Resist people in New York have been doing demonstrations at like
right.
Trump Hotel, Trump Towers, different places where they've been holding up signs that
6 feet apart.
Yeah, 6 feet apart, saying signs that say Trump lies, people die, a number of different things like that. And they were protesting Reverend Graham paid for hospital that was set up in Central Park that made doctors and healthcare providers sign, LGBT, anti-LGBT clauses. They turned away LGBT patients, and there was demonstrations held, outside that hospital, and it's since been shut down. But ironically, some of the activists that were doing those demonstrations got arrested, even though they were socially distancing and wearing masks. And as a result of that, de Blasio has
The mayor of
declared
New
a
York.
moratorium on demonstrations. That's taking away people's freedom of speech.
Right.
And so, legal challenges have been been filed by Norman Siegel, who's kind of the guru in New York for civil liberties, trying to challenge that prohibition against demonstrations. But that's part of what we're facing right now.
See. All right, last audience question, and then I think Mike has a question that will close us out. So we hear about changing social behavior in first world countries. What's happening in third world countries right now as a result of COVID? And I know, Eric, if you want to get started with this one. I know you.
It's interesting. I haven't been in touch with a lot of activists in the developing world. So a lot of what I know is just, from news coverage. And, we've seen different countries respond more effectively than we have here, just based on, the results, China, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, their initial responses were, a lot better than us. They're in places like China, Hong Kong, Singapore, there because of the SARS and bird flu and Asian flu and other epidemics that struck there, much more strongly than they struck here. Their propensity and their willingness to wear masks when alerted to an airborne infection, gave them a leg up, and their response was a lot better. In places like Africa and other developing countries where they're living on $1 or a couple of dollars a day, there's no way in hell they're going to be able to afford masks. They're often living 8 people to a 1-room small shelter, and so they're going to get hit a lot harder and not be able to respond without somebody else paying for the response. And so
but you do have some, Eric, you do have some really good responses in countries with limited resources. So in Nairobi, I understand they're identifying neighborhoods that are hotspots for the virus, and it turns out that one of the biggest shopping areas, expensive shopping areas, has been a hotspot. They basically closed that neighborhood down without closing down other places where it would be a huge impossibility for people living in poverty. India has done an amazing job at limiting infection by quickly shutting that entire country down. Now, you shut that country down, there are millions of people literally who live hand to mouth. If they can't like run their tuk-tuk to pick up people, that's the money that they eat with that day. They are very, very close to starvation. And you saw people, migrant workers, walking hundreds and hundreds of miles to get home because of the transportation system. But India now is doing a mega airlift to get its citizens back from places like Middle Eastern countries where they're treated almost like slaves, and where they've basically had no food, no medicine, because they're treated as foreigners, slaves. So countries that have very limited resources are doing incredible jobs. But in Russia, where it's exploding in Moscow, it's very interesting because I was hearing yesterday, it seems that Vladimir Putin is following the same playbook as Donald Trump. He's staying holed up with his sycophants all around him, and he's making regional governors make decisions about how to handle coronavirus. So I don't know who was the first one to do it, Trump or Putin, but boy, they're on the same wavelength.
I really worry about refugees around the world too. You know, I can't remember the number, something like 17 million refugees in refugee camps, you know, around the world. And, you know, there's no way to socially distance there. You know, they're lucky if they're getting adequate food. They won't get any medical care. They're certainly not going to get protective equipment. And, you know, COVID is going to just decimate refugees around the world.
Kind of amazing there haven't been more outbreaks in those situations than
there have been in the migrant camps just outside the U.S. border in Mexico, where people are crowded in because we won't let them in.
So I want to kind of close this. We touched on this a moment ago when you talked about protests and de Blasio and others kind of putting a halt to it. But, you know, back in the 80s, you guys with ACT UP, you know, you couldn't be contained. You stood up, you did whatever it took. It was activism in the ultimate. What is it going to take here? Let's assume that these opening ups in some of these states lead to more outbreak, and it doesn't cause more of a curtailing of infections. What's it going to take for us to unify and demand better treatment and, you know, storm the governments that are supposed to be leading us?
It's going to take teaching people again that we are the government, that we have the power. It's teaching, I mean, certainly in the US, it's teaching people they need to go to their congressional offices. They certainly need to vote more than anything else, but they need to go to their congressional offices. They need to donate to campaigns for people who know what to do till it hurts. They need to get involved. And I think, you know, there was an article in the Washington Post of an older woman in her 70s in the upper Midwest who's angry. She is pissed off, but she has no way to channel. Nobody's giving her a way to channel that anger. And that's what ACT UP did for us. It gave us a place, and that's why I end up going there, because I needed a place to channel how pissed off and angry I was, like Eric said. And we need to give all these people who are really angry right now a way to channel that anger.
Maybe you guys want to form another organization, Eric?
Well, I think initially we have to, you know, try to start using social media platforms like, you know, Twitter and Facebook and you know, other Instagram, etc., to try to get people talking about the need to be activists and to push back against this government, you know, that is doing all the wrong things and doesn't give a shit about people and only cares about, you know, maintaining power and getting reelected. And I don't understand why people aren't storming the streets. And, you know, you see like
because they're shut in. They're shut in.
Well,
they can't.
That's one thing, but you know, it's been a long time since people have really had a demonstration mentality in this country. In the French, you know, where you know the unions are strong, when things go awry, you know, get millions of people in the street raising their political objections. We need that type of response here, and you know, I think it's going to take more organizing not only by activists and nonprofit organizations, but by unions, by churches, to try to get the government to pay attention.
And I think we need to really figure out, there's one place where there should be people seizing the narrative, and that's the Democrats in the House of Representatives. They supposedly have a committee that's looking at this. I want to know why Nancy Pelosi or some other representative isn't on TV every day giving scientific facts and seizing the narrative. I wrote letters to my representatives saying, why aren't you doing this? Why are you letting other people control the narrative? And that we need to change the conversation.
Unfortunately, the other party is much better at social media than we are at this point. If you look at the amount of airtime, the amount of followers, et cetera, that Trump has versus Biden, it's 10 to 1. So
he's the president. He's the president. Of course, he has more.
We've fallen behind on that front as a DNC organized effort.
Yeah, I think we need to try to organize like a Twitter army of people who have a conscience and morality to clap back against his Twitter power and try to disarm that. I see a friend of mine, Paul Barrett, has made a comment about protesters in Brazil and Israel are protesting, and they're maintaining 6-foot distance to take to the streets. And there are ways to do that. People can use masks. They can stay 6 feet apart and still protest. So we need to get out.
They appear to have him on the ropes, possibly not far from being pushed out by the Supreme Court. So resistance can work.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
guess what? It turned out that in today's Washington Post, Donald Trump committed voter fraud by voting in Florida and declaring Florida his residence, because he says he's living at Mar-a-Lago, and the Mar-a-Lago charter specifically forbids it from being used as a residence for him. So that's something that goes back to the 90s. So Donald Trump has now proven that there is voter fraud, but he's the one that did it.
All right. On that note, this has been a really informative session. We appreciate you guys all contributing. We hope the audience has found this worthwhile. This is being recorded, and in due course, we'll have it up probably on YouTube and on bammer.co, our website. So stay tuned. We'll keep you informed as to where to find it. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Peace, baby.
Thank you, everybody.
Stay safe.